The United States is at war with Iran, but if you ask most people why, they'll say something about nuclear weapons, or terrorism, or Israel, and those things are part of the story. But they are not the real story. The real story is about something far less dramatic on the surface, and far more consequential underneath. It's about a financial system that has quietly funded American global power for 50 years. It's called the petrodollar, and right now, it is under serious threat. In this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what the petrodollar is, why it matters more than any military alliance or nuclear deal, and why, when you understand it, the war on Iran stops looking like a foreign policy decision and starts looking like an act of financial self-preservation. Stay with me. This one changes how you see everything. Let's start from the beginning. In 1971, President Nixon made one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. He took the United States off the gold standard. Before that moment, every US dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by gold held in Fort Knox. After that moment, it wasn't. Which raises an obvious question. If the dollar isn't backed by gold, what gives it value? The answer came 3 years later, in 1974, through a secret agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The deal was simple. The Saudis would price all of their oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the Americans would provide military protection to the Saudi regime. And because Saudi Arabia was, and still is, the swing producer in global oil markets, what Saudi Arabia does, everyone else eventually follows. Within a few years, virtually all oil traded on global markets was priced in US dollars. Think about what that means in practice. Japan needs oil. Japan buys oil in dollars. So Japan needs to hold dollars. To get dollars, Japan needs to sell goods to America, or hold US Treasury bonds. Either way, Japan is tied into the American financial system. Same for Germany, same for South Korea, same for India, same for China. Every country on Earth that needs energy, which is every country on Earth, needs US dollars to buy it. That creates a permanent, structural, global demand for the American currency. And that demand is what allows the United States to do something no other country in history has been able to do: run enormous deficits, print money, and borrow at low interest rates, without triggering the kind of inflation that would normally collapse an economy. Right now, the United States is $39 trillion in debt. To put that in perspective, that is more debt than the entire European Union produces in economic output in a year. Any other country carrying that debt load would be in a severe crisis: currency collapse, skyrocketing interest rates, economic depression. The United States is not in that crisis, specifically because the petrodollar system forces the world to keep absorbing American debt. As long as countries need oil, they need dollars. And as long as they need dollars, they buy US Treasury bonds. And as long as they buy US Treasury bonds, America can keep borrowing. That is the engine of American imperial power. Not its military, not its technology, not its culture. The petrodollar. Lose the petrodollar, and you lose everything built on top of it. Now here's where things get interesting. For the past decade, that system has been showing serious cracks. The first major blow came in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. In response, the United States and its allies froze over $200 billion in Russian sovereign assets. Money that Russia held in Western banks, just gone, seized overnight. Now, from a Western perspective, that was a legitimate act of economic warfare against an aggressor state. But from the perspective of every other country watching, it sent a terrifying message. If America can freeze Russia's money, it can freeze anyone's money. The dollar, which was supposed to be a neutral reserve currency, a stable store of value that every nation could trust, had just been weaponized, and the world noticed. In the months that followed, you saw a quiet but accelerating movement away from US Treasury bonds. Central banks around the world started buying gold at a pace not seen since the 1960s. China dramatically increased its gold reserves. The BRICS nations began serious discussions about creating an alternative to the dollar-denominated financial system. China in particular started building what analysts are calling a gold corridor, a framework for pricing trade, and eventually commodities, in currencies backed by something other than American goodwill. The implications of this are enormous. If oil can be priced in yuan, or in a BRICS currency, or in gold, then countries no longer need dollars to buy energy. And if they no longer need dollars, they no longer need to hold US Treasury bonds. And if they stop holding Treasury bonds, the United States loses its ability to carry $39 trillion in debt without consequence. The entire financial architecture of American power begins to unwind. This is not a theoretical risk. This is an active process that has been underway for several years. And in Washington, the people who understand this, the strategists, the Treasury officials, the military planners, are watching it with something close to panic. So where does Iran fit into all of this? Iran sits on the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and through that 33 kilometers passes roughly 20% of all the world's oil supply. Every day, tankers carrying Saudi oil, UAE oil, Kuwaiti oil, Iraqi oil, and Iranian oil pass through that strait on their way to Asia and Europe. Iran does not need to fire a single missile to threaten the global economy. It simply needs to close that strait. And when the United States attacked Iran, killing its supreme leader and striking military infrastructure, that is exactly what Iran did. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed. Now think about what happens next. Europe needs that oil. East Asia needs that oil. China, Japan, South Korea, countries that import the majority of their energy from the Middle East, suddenly find themselves cut off from their primary supply. Where do they turn? The answer, if you are sitting in Washington, is to us. North America holds enormous oil and gas reserves. American LNG exports have been growing rapidly. The infrastructure to supply Europe and Asia exists or can be built. If Middle Eastern oil is offline, whether through war, blockade, or strategic disruption, the world is forced to pivot to North American energy. And crucially, North American energy is priced in US dollars. So the strategy, as analysts watching this closely are beginning to understand, is not simply about Iran's nuclear program, or Iran's support for proxy forces, or even regional security. The strategy is about energy market control, knock out Iranian oil, disrupt Russian oil. We saw Ukrainian drone strikes take out roughly 40% of Russia's main export hub in recent weeks. Apply pressure on Venezuelan oil. The United States moved against Venezuela earlier this year, systematically removed the alternative suppliers from the global market, and the world, with no other choice, buys from North America, which means the world keeps buying in dollars, which means the petrodollar survives. This is why Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, even as the war escalated, removed sanctions on both Russian and Iranian oil sales. The goal is not to strangle oil supply entirely. That would push prices to $200 a barrel and collapse the global economy, including the American economy. The goal is to position North America as the dominant supplier. You remove enough competition to shift the balance of power, not to eliminate the market entirely. Now let's talk about something that has confused a lot of observers in recent weeks. Why did Trump offer Iran a negotiated settlement, a 10-point framework that included lifting sanctions, allowing uranium enrichment, and providing security guarantees to Iranian proxies including Hamas and Hezbollah, and then walk away from those negotiations days later in Islamabad? The delegation that traveled to Pakistan included the Treasury Secretary, a senior diplomat, and high-level advisors. Iran sent its foreign minister. Both sides publicly described it as a serious framework. And then nothing. The American delegation reportedly rejected Iran's terms outright, and the talks collapsed. What was the point? There are two possible explanations, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is that the offer was never genuine. The Iranians, based on decades of experience, know that the United States has historically used negotiations as an intelligence-gathering exercise to identify leaders, map decision-making structures, and set up targeted operations. The offer may have been a feint. The second explanation is more strategic. Trump is a negotiator by instinct and by training. Before he can commit to a major escalation, particularly one that risks drawing China directly into the conflict, he needs to understand China's position. China imports approximately 90% of all Iranian oil. China has invested over $200 billion in Iranian infrastructure as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. China and Iran have a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement. If the United States destroys Iranian oil infrastructure and forces Iran out of the market permanently, China loses a critical and deeply discounted energy supplier. Would China retaliate? Would China intervene? Or would China, under sufficient economic pressure, be willing to accept the new reality and shift toward buying American LNG? The fact that Iran agreed to come to the table at all suggests that China applied pressure on Tehran to negotiate. Iran would not have sent a high-level delegation to talks it considered pointless, particularly given the risk that Israel has a documented history of targeting diplomats. Iran went because China asked them to, and if China asked them to, it means China is already calculating whether a deal with America is possible. Trump, reading that signal, felt confident enough to push harder. He announced a naval blockade of Iran immediately after the talks collapsed, not as a punishment for negotiation failure, but as a pressure tactic aimed as much at Beijing as at Tehran. The message to China: your energy supply runs through waters we control. Come to the table in May, or this gets worse. Now, does this strategy work? In the short term, there is a strong case that it does. China's economy is under serious strain. The American tariff campaign, the disruption to Middle Eastern energy, the degradation of the Belt and Road's physical infrastructure in Iran, railways, ports, road networks, all of this creates genuine pain for Beijing. China receives roughly 60% of its total energy needs from the Middle East. Another significant portion comes from Russia and Iran, two countries currently under pressure. The economic incentive to reach an accommodation with Washington is real. In the short term, Trump may well extract significant concessions. China may agree to purchase American LNG. The petrodollar may get a reprieve. But here is where history becomes relevant. Empires that transition from providing order to extracting tribute have a consistent track record. They win the first few rounds, and then the world organizes against them. The United States spent the better part of 70 years building its global position, not just through military force, but through the perception that it was a reliable, rules-based actor. Other nations may not have liked American power, but they trusted American institutions enough to park their money there, to price their commodities in American currency, to send their ships through American-patrolled waters. That perception is now being dismantled, visibly and deliberately. The freezing of Russian assets, the seizure of shadow fleet tankers, the blockade of Venezuela, the systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure in Iran, bridges, railways, universities. These are not the actions of a policeman, they are the actions of a protection racket. And every country watching, including American allies in Europe and East Asia, is updating its risk model. The question is no longer will America behave predictably. The question is how do we reduce our exposure to American behavior? That calculation played out across dozens of countries over the next decade is what actually threatens the petrodollar. Not Iran's missiles, not China's gold reserves, but the slow grinding erosion of the trust that makes the system function. The Athenians learned this in the Peloponnesian War. Athens was the dominant naval power of the ancient Mediterranean. It extracted tribute from its allies under the banner of collective security. And over time, those allies, one by one, began to see Athens not as a protector, but as an oppressor. The coalition that eventually brought Athens down was built from the resentment it had generated at the height of its power. America is not Athens. The parallel is imperfect. But the dynamic, dominance generating resistance, resistance generating coalition, coalition challenging dominance, that dynamic is universal. So let me leave you with this. The war on Iran is real. The missiles are real. The deaths are real. But the war is being fought over something that most people never hear discussed in mainstream coverage, a 50-year-old financial architecture that underpins American global power, and that is, for the first time in its history, genuinely vulnerable. Whether that architecture survives depends on questions that go far beyond any military outcome in the Middle East. It depends on whether China, Japan, and Europe are willing to keep denominating their energy trade in US dollars when America has demonstrated it will weaponize that relationship. It depends on whether the short-term pain of resisting American pressure outweighs the long-term risk of remaining dependent on it. And it depends on whether Washington understands, before it is too late, that empires sustained by force alone do not last. Those are questions without clean answers. But they are the right questions, and now you know to ask them. If this analysis was useful to you, share it with someone who has been trying to make sense of what is happening in the Middle East. The mainstream coverage will not tell you this story. That is why channels like this one exist. I will see you in the next one.